Today's opening looks ridiculous, but it has a point. The game typically starts e4, g6, d4, knight f6, e5, and knight to h5. Now black has wasted two moves, sending their knight to the edge of the board. We've allowed white to build a big centre, and this just looks very bad. But what we've actually done is provoked white into building a structure that we already know how to attack. Let's take a look. So here's that typical structure where black has pawns on e6 and d5 and white has pawns on e5 and d4. This is a classical advanced French structure. You might see it in the French defence, the Caro-Kann, or even in the Norwegian Rat. And the idea for black here generally is not to attack the head of the pawn chain directly, but instead to focus on the base of the pawn chain on d4. And all of our pieces are going to revolve around the idea of trying to attack this base of the pawn chain. For example, typical moves you'd see from black are c5 attacking the base of the pawn chain. And one minor piece from black I want you to pay particular attention to is our kingside knight, which very typically in these structures makes its way to the f5 square from where it attacks again the base of the pawn chain. Usually in the structure via e7 and then to f5, sometimes even via h6 and then to f5, but always aiming for that f5 square to undermine white's structure. Now with these ideas in mind, the Norwegian Rat opening move order starts to make a lot more sense. After e4, our first idea is to play knight f6, and this is the provoking stage. We're trying to provoke the move e5, and our follow-up is to come to h5. Now, if we do this immediately, obviously white can just take the knight immediately, so this doesn't work. That's why we would like here to have already played the move g6. First of all, defending the knight and, as we're going to see, allowing the knight to reroute via that newly available g7 square. So that's why after e4, we actually start the game with g6, and after the typical d4, now we can go for knight f6. And again, this is stage one. This is provoking the move e5. And we're starting to see already that white is getting this advanced French pawn structure. Now, black still has to put their pawns on these squares to get that structure exactly, but that is going to come later. Now that we've done stage one, the knight comes to h5. And again, it looks completely random, but now that we understand the structure we're aiming for, we can understand that eventually this knight wants to come to f5, where it's going to attack the base of the white pawn chain. Now I just want to make a quick comparison with the Norwegian Rat's kind of cousin openings, the French defence and the Caro-Kann. For example, in the French defence, after e4, e6, d4, d5 and e5, this is the advanced French, black gets to attack the base of the pawn chain quickly by playing the move c5 in one go. So this is a very quick version of it. The downside for black is that this bishop is blocked inside the pawn chain and it can't escape outside the pawn chain. Now if we look at the other cousin of the Norwegian Rat, the Caro-Kann, which starts e4, c6, d4, d5, and then in the advanced variation with the immediate e5, black can play c5 now. Again, it's the same underlying structure and black is attacking the base of the pawn chain straight away. This is a slower version of this opening because black had to spend two moves getting a pawn to c5, but the upside for black is that this bishop can still get out the pawn chain because we've not committed to the move e6 yet. So all of these openings actually are from the same underlying structure and from the same family. They just differ in terms of starting move order. A key thing is bishop activity, whether or not this bishop can get outside the pawn chain, and also tempi or time. How quickly does black get to play the move c5, and how quickly does black manage to get their knight into the f5 square? So if these are all from the same family of openings, then a good question is which one is the best to actually use? And that's why I've made this short little graphic here to kind of compare these three openings. Two key factors in that decision are time spent making the moves we want to play, and also our light squared bishop, which might or might not get outside the pawn chain. Now, the French defense is very fast. The knight gets to f5 in two moves, and the c5 break happens in one move. But it has this problem of this bad light square bishop that is stuck inside the pawn chain and struggles to contribute to the long-term mission we have of undermining the pawn chain and attacking the d4 square. The Caro-Kann, once again, gets the knight to f5 very quickly in 2 moves, but it makes the c5 break slowly in just 2 moves. It goes c6 first and then c5. But it has a good bishop. We managed to get the bishop outside the pawn chain and trade itself off for a defender of the d4 square. Now, the Norwegian Rat is slow in the knight move. It takes 4 moves to get to f5. It goes to f6, h5, g7, and then f5. It's fast in the c5 break in 1 move, and again, we're going to see later that it does have a good bishop which can get outside the pawn chain. Now, there are pros and cons to each of these, but what I would recommend practically for most club players is that the French defence way of playing this with a bad bishop inside the pawn chain is practically quite difficult and quite nuanced to understand. In terms of the Caro-Kann versus the Norwegian Rat, they both have the benefit of that good bishop, but in terms of those 2 key moves, knight to f5 and c5, the Norwegian Rat spends 5 tempi making both of those happen, while the Caro-Kann gets both of those moves in 4 tempi. So at first glance, this makes the Rat look like an advanced Caro-Kann, just a tempo down. And objectively, that's a fair criticism, but practically, the move order has a point. Now, in the advanced Caro-Kann, black actually has to choose in this position between 2 quite uncomfortable moves, one being bishop f5, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain, but allowing something like the tile variation after h4. Now, this is exactly the way I recommend to play with white. I have a video on that, link in the description. The other choice that black has here is to play c5 immediately, and if white goes around the normal advanced French structure stuff, this would be great for us and we get exactly what we want. But one really annoying option white has is to take this pawn immediately whilst we're not defending it and try to hold on to that pawn, and this is a completely different type of game that we're getting. So yes, collectively, the Norwegian Rat does spend that extra tempo, but it's not necessarily a wasted tempo. It's almost like we're delaying committing certain moves while we're waiting for white to commit to a certain setup first. So let's start by looking at typical ways you would get to that advanced French structure from this typical position in the Norwegian Rat. I'm going to look at the most common moves at around the 1600 to 2200 level in the Lichess database. Typically goes bishop e2. Now we start re-maneuvering that knight once it's attacked by the bishop. Knight f3, d5, and we're starting to see how we're getting this advanced French structure. We're going to later put a pawn on e6, but first of all, we're going to get this bishop outside the pawn chain. Now remember, the whole point of this opening, or this structure, is to undermine the pawn chain by attacking the pawn on d4, which is the base of the pawn chain. Now, this light square bishop can't attack this dark square directly, but what it can do is trade itself off for one of the defenders of that dark square, and that's why it goes to g4 with the intention of just taking that knight. Typically goes h3, we take the knight, and by taking that knight, this d4 pawn just became a little bit more vulnerable. We follow up with e6, and look, we've got exactly that advanced French structure. We've got pawns on e6 and d5, white has pawns on d4 and e5. So now that we've seen how we get this structure, where do our pieces belong from here? Remember, the whole idea is undermining this d4 square. Now, we've already seen how our light square bishop can come here and trade itself off for a defender of that d4 square. This knight can come to f5, attacking the square directly. This pawn, when we're ready, can come to c5, attack the pawn directly. This knight can come to c6, attacking the pawn. Our dark square bishop is a little bit trickier to see how it can contribute, but one idea that I like is to, at some point, play bishop e7, bring it out to the g5 square, where it can try to trade for white's dark square bishop, because that dark square bishop is something that could defend the base of the pawn chain at some point. So you're starting to see here how all of our minor pieces are all being developed in such a way to contribute to this long-term mission we have in this structure of undermining the pawn chain and overwhelming the d4 point. Now, if you're currently a Caro-Kann player and you're a little bit skeptical about this Norwegian Rat idea with pawn to g6, one thing you can try to do to experiment this is in your normal Caro-Kann, after they play knight c3 on move 3, you can actually experiment with something called the Gurgenidze system here and play g6. And this is something you can go and look at independently, but you're going to get very similar ideas in this system to the Norwegian Rat. Now, of course, when we play this Norwegian Rat system, white is not obligated to push their e-pawn. So one alternative you might see quite commonly is they simply defend it with knight c3. And what we're going to try to do in typical kind of Caro-Kann fashion is try to provoke them to play the move e5 with c6 and d5. So for example, c6 first, knight f3 is quite common. Now we play d5. And what we're trying to do is to get the exact same structure where we provoke the move e5 now, and we respond with all the same stuff of rerouting our knight and playing against this normal advanced French structure. But It's very common that they just go for an exchange variation, something like this. And what I want you to notice is that we're transitioning now into another key structure, which is the Carlsbad structure, where notice black has these two pawns on the A and B files on the queen side versus white's pawn majority, and we can go for something called the minority attack in the long term. Now, that's a completely different structure and deserves its own video, but a couple of little points I'll make about it. First of all, white really wants to have a pawn on c3 in those structures, and what they should really be wanting to do is reroute this knight to the d3 square. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about why all that is true, I think GM Aman Hambleton made a really good video about that on his Chess Bra channel in something like the 100 tips only a grandmaster knows, something like that. I'll leave a link in the description. Another thing I'll say about this minority attack structure is that one of white's main weapons is a very quick kingside assault whilst we're going for the minority attack. And I'll typically say that against the fianchetto structure, which is what we now do in this variation, that quick kingside attack is very hard to achieve practically. So this might make a good future video from us. Now, objectively speaking, this Norwegian Rat may not be the best opening to play, but practically it forces black into one of two typical structures where we get this advanced French structure where we have a clear single plan to undermine the structure, or it pushes them into a Carlsbad structure where we have a very clear minority attack we want to implement. And against those two structures, the database and evidence shows that white often misplays those and isn't really sure what they're supposed to be doing. Now, if you like this style of playing where you understand one fundamental underlying principle and you use it to help navigate your openings, then that's exactly how I coach in my private coaching. Link down below.